Good morning. It's good to see everybody survive the Halloween, full moon, fall back all in one night without any injuries. It's really a beautiful day yesterday in a lot of ways. I like to get up right when the sun's coming up and go for a long run, and not only the color in the sky yesterday, but with all the leaves on the ground and whatnot, it was just a glowing day in so many ways. And then as we went out at night with the kids, not sure what this was going to look like, doing trick-or-treating or what in the midst of this, there really was actually a lot of encouragement for me in that. Number one, seeing people who are being considerate for others. Number two, seeing people who are really inventive. We saw at least one house that looked like they had pulled their gutter off of their house to be able to deliver candy from a distance through some kind of a chute. But even in the midst of this, we actually met some neighbors that we hadn't met before. And so just, again, a reminder in so many ways of there's beauty even in the midst of challenges and hardship if we have eyes to look for it and eyes to see it. And so it was an encouraging day for me in a lot of ways in that respect. It's November now, and so with the new month comes a new focus in our Sunday morning lessons as we progress, as we have this year. And so this month we're focused on the role of prayer in our efforts to show the image of God in our lives and to adopt that. And admittedly, to be honest, with all that's going on this week for our nation, there was another lesson that I wanted to focus on every time I sat down to work on this, but I'm going to stick to my assignment. But I do want to share just one thought before we jump into that. As Christians are considering this week and or have already considered in past weeks, the intersection of our calling to bear God's image with our civic duty and our civic responsibility to choose not just those who will set laws for our country, but play an important leadership role. What we find at that intersection is seemingly an increasing divergence of opinion on how to make those choices, and seemingly an increasing amount of fear about those choices and what comes after them. We see some Christians who are convinced they know that there's a right and a wrong choice, and they're fearful of what happens if their choice doesn't win, and they're fearful of or struggling with others who don't see it that way. In other case, Christians are looking at the two choices and seeing only two paths that both lead to destruction, looking not at the individual differences between candidates and their administrations, but looking at how far both are removed from the image of God. And they find fear in that or find challenges in that. And we could, given more time, probably define several other buckets, right? Several other distinctions. But the thing that, as I think about that no matter where we fall in that spectrum, that I think all need to hear is the reminder that it's the Most High that rules the kingdom of men and gives to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men, as we read back in Daniel in chapter 4. And so as important as it is for us to search our conscience, to try and remove biases and preferences that have nothing to do with God and things that are important to him and that cloud our judgment, and to consider the votes that we cast, we must at the end of the day remember that it is the Most High who rules in this kingdom and who will always rule. And we also must remember that that statement was made at a time when God had used the leader of an idolatrous nation to judge his chosen people for their failure to live wholeheartedly in commitment to him, just as Derek read from Jeremiah 31, showed the shortcoming of those who professed to be followers of God but hadn't. And so God brought judgment through this other king, but then he humbled that other king when he even failed to realize that it was the Most High who ruled. And so whatever happens on Tuesday, let us remember that our calling on Wednesday will be the same as our calling on Monday. That won't change. It's the Most High who desires that all come to a knowledge of him and be saved, and who desires that we who have committed ourselves to him be instruments of that purpose as he works to carry that out. And the primary way that we do that is one conversation and one heart at a time. And coincidentally, that's also how you change the direction of a democracy that's governed by the will of its people. But most of all, it's commit that no matter what happens this week, no matter what it stirs or what follows from Tuesday, that we each will have the same commitment to that purpose, to that focus, and to that calling that we have for God and his kingdom, no matter what. So just wanted to share that reminder and hope that we all keep that in focus this week as whatever happens, happens. But as we focus back on our topic of prayer this month, we want to look at as we do with the beginning of each of these months, what we can glean from Jesus and his life and his teachings about the importance of this in being the image of God and living the image of God in our lives. We, of course, recognize that Jesus was the image of God in flesh, and so he gives us the model of all things, and so we begin each month with that focus. I think it's important to note, perhaps a little bit oddly, having just said that there's actually quite a bit in Scripture about prayer that it needs to be considered even beyond the life of Jesus. And that's not a negative thing to note that, but there's just a wealth of points to consider, a wealth of things and insights that are shared that we don't actually get from Jesus' life. You know, you think about the Psalms, right? They provide us the deepest and the richest insight into actually the mind of someone who's in prayer and communicating to our Father. And so, and we'll make this point later on, whereas in Jesus, we actually see quite little in terms of what was in his mindset in his moments of prayer. We see in the Psalms and other places a rich treasure of insight into what that mind can and should look like. And we recognize that it's really in other scriptures outside the biographies of Jesus that we see more of a picture of Christians praying together. Again, a point that we'll come back to in a minute, but there's actually much beyond those biographies. So when we talk this morning, I don't want to mistake and think that, you know, the points that we focus on are the only things to consider, right? We're focusing on this in Jesus' life, right? But there's much beyond this, and those will be what we focus on as we go throughout the rest of this month. But as we look at Jesus and look at his teachings and his example, you know, though there's many important lessons that we can get from even just that, I want to just focus rather briefly this morning on two specific things in his life. One is the intimacy that's intended in prayer with our Father, and the other is the attitude that we bring to prayer. Both of these things, I think, as we look at Jesus' life, actually help provide the foundation that everything else is built on when we consider prayer and its role in our lives as people who are trying to reflect the image of God. As we look at all the examples of Jesus' prayers, and we won't walk through them all, thought about it, but we won't walk through them all this morning. But we see, of course, that the occasions for Jesus to give himself in prayer varied. You know, from the earliest example, or one of the earliest examples of his baptism, you know, when it's actually his prayer that then precedes precedes God responding to him that this is my son in whom I am well pleased. We see him doing it before he's about to perform miracles and heal, and then we see him doing it after he does those things to give thanks for his ability to do those things. We see before he selects the disciples or the apostles, of course, he gives himself. We see when his disciples and followers return from carrying the message out to Israel, he gives himself into prayer. We see him doing it before meals, sometimes on an individual basis, sometimes with others. We see him praying when the little children are brought to him to lay his hands on them, praying for them and presumably with them in those cases. And at the end of his life, we see him praying even on the cross in the midst of all that entailed. But when we look at the Gospels and we look at the biographies of Jesus, and we consider all that we see in prayer in Jesus' life, it's hard to miss the concentration that we see in that of Jesus praying alone. For all the different examples that we have of Jesus' praying, the thing that comes up repeatedly is how he gave himself and committed himself to praying alone. In Mark chapter 1, and you can turn to these examples if you want, we won't actually read through them. But in Mark chapter 1, we see early in his ministry as the crowds are growing, you know, we're told that he gets up well before dawn to give himself both time, but then also a solitary place to pray and to commit himself. Luke chapter 5, Luke, who perhaps gives us more of a focus on Jesus' praying habits than maybe some of the others, tells us that he repeatedly is going to the wilderness to pray, not just once, not just on a certain occasion. He's repeatedly doing this. And note that, you know, it's one thing to say, and we sometimes talk about, you know, going to a bedroom or a quiet place on the house, but going to the wilderness, you know, it wasn't like he just got up and did a 10-minute commute, right? That was something that required deliberation and commitment to do that. Same thing with the examples where we see him going to a mountain. Again, a place where others are unlikely to be or to follow. We see that in Luke 6, that he goes to the mountain to pray all night before choosing his apostles. We see him in Matthew 14, where he's sending the multitudes away and going to a mountain apart again so that he can pray. Even though his focus, and we think about his ministry as being a public ministry, and his focus is on calling people, he's actually making it a point to either leave or send people away so that he can give himself to this time in prayer. In Luke 9, he's praying alone. The disciples know where he's at, but he's praying alone, even though he's with them in some way. And as we see in his last night, both the example in John 17, where he's praying for his disciples and all that would follow after them. And then, of course, we see in Mark 14 and other accounts where, he's praying as he asks God to remove the cup that is before him. And the thing that I want us to see from all of this, noting that probably isn't anything new, right? But the point that we want to see is not just the fact that Jesus got rid of distractions, or not just that he made it an important point, but to recognize that when you consider the circumstances of what Jesus is doing here, this isn't just about the fact that he gave himself to prayer a lot. It's that he made space, he made a way, he sought to be able to pray in a way so that he could have complete intimacy with God, so that he could have intimacy in a one-on-one way that was not possible simply or only in praying alone, or praying with others, or praying in the midst of the daily things that were coming up. He shows us this broad and diverse role for prayer, and I don't want to miss that. But this emphasis, this focus, is on how Jesus made this space so that he could be completely alone and committed with his Father. As we said already, right, it's not actually the content of Jesus' prayers that he's modeling for us, although he's going to give us instructions like we'll talk about as an example of prayer. But it's not the content of his prayers that the biographies of Jesus give us as an example. It's the commitment to this space and to the depth of the prayer that's held up for us in the example of Jesus in his life. Consider even this example, going back to the night before his crucifixion. Jesus is with his disciples. We can see again, we mentioned Mark 14, but it's in the other Gospels as well. He's with his disciples, and he knows that all of them are about to face a trial like which none of them have ever experienced, right? So he knows that they're all in this together, so to speak, in what's about to come. But yet even then, he tells his disciples to pray themselves while he goes off to pray alone. And again, when you stop and think about it, it almost seems a little bit counter, right? Why wouldn't Jesus bring his disciples and pray with them? But yet he recognizes the importance of that case, of him having the time alone with his Father. And perhaps that's in part, of course, because his burden in that moment was going to be different than theirs. But yet even in that case, even as close as he was to his disciples, he saw that it was important to have that intimate time alone with the Father. We think about the fact that Jesus was God, right? He didn't give up being God. But yet, rather than that truth relieving him of the need to pray, it actually committed him stronger to that more than any example than we see. Even though he had a relationship with the Father, unlike that we have yet known, that fact actually made him more committed, not less, to this time alone, this time in prayer. It's been said in different ways, and it's not a perfect statement, but it's also important to note, this is just kind of a way to say things that sticks with us sometimes. It says, Jesus was too busy not to pray, right? He had too much going on, too much work, too much focus for him to not put this type of time into it, to not put this type of earnestness into his prayers. And so the thing that, as we consider that example, I just want us to think about first is that even if we step out of this context and we think just about relationships in general, right, we can recognize that you can't develop a meaningful relationship with someone when you're not alone with that person in some committed, focused way. Even spouses, right, who may spend their entire day together, with children or with others or whatever it may be, right? Even at the end of that day, even if they've spent every waking moment together, there's still a need for those spouses to have a time alone, right? You can't have a close relationship with your spouse or a family member or whoever it might be if that time is always interacting with others. And so we recognize that, and we realize, hopefully, that the same is no different with us, right? Even though we may spend a lot of our time on spiritual things or a lot of our time on godly focused things, right? that doesn't actually eliminate the need for us to have a deep and committed time with God alone. We focused a little bit on this in our study in Matthew Wednesday night, in our Matthew and Mark study, where we see in Matthew chapter 6, and we'll turn to a couple passages here in a minute, but Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus is instructing his followers not to give in to the ways that the Pharisees go about things. And he makes the point in giving, in prayer, and in fasting that these things are intended for the secret relationship that each has with the Father. And by secret, it doesn't mean that it has to be hidden or concealed, but it's secret in terms that it's focused and it's one-on-one, and it's not solely there interacting with others. And so when we pray, let us remember that we're not just fulfilling some act of service that God has called us to do, but what we're trying to do is to establish the foundation of an intimate relationship with God. We can give ourselves to all the other good things that God has called us to do, but still yet struggle to have that intimate relationship with Him if we don't provide the time and the opportunity to make that happen. And Jesus shows us that time and time again in His examples. But as we also think about Jesus and His teachings about prayer, I want to think about His attitude that He calls us to have in prayer. You could turn over to Matthew 6 now, if you would. I do want to read 3 of these teachings that He has. You know, in Matthew 6, as we just mentioned, he's going through the Sermon on the Mount. He's telling His disciples, telling His followers to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, and He's showing them all the ways in which what has been in the past construed as righteousness and faithfulness to God is actually missing the point. And as He says here in verse 5, beginning this section that often, of course, is quoted as the Lord's Prayer, we see in verse 5, He says, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." In this example, He starts with the example of what not to do, right, in the hypocrites of the Pharisees that He calls out. But His point ultimately is the humility of heart, or at least one of His main points is the humility that's required in this, the attitude of humility that we bring to this, realizing that we appeal to God not through lofty words and empty phrases and specific ways that we might say things, but we appeal to God by humbly and quietly and intimately coming to Him and submitting ourselves to Him and to His will and to His purposes. And also in that moment, if you notice what He says there in verses 14 and 15, recognizing the importance that even as we do this, that we do it with an attitude of forgiveness to others, just as we have been forgiven. And so the same attitude that we take to God and that we bring to God, we recognize the role that He's describing here and how our relationship with others and our willingness to forgive, our willingness to be merciful, has a role in that. Think over to Luke 18, which makes this point again. Luke 18, Jesus is telling a parable, telling a series of parables as He walks through this. And in verse 9, He says, "He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted." The Pharisee was doing the right things, but he was doing it to exalt himself. In his mind, he was exalted above the other because of the things that he had done. But what Jesus says is it's the humility of heart that justifies the man who says, Father, I'm a sinner, be merciful to me. And so we see this theme of humility, this theme of recognition of where we are in our need for God. In many examples, it serves as the foundation of a proper and an appropriate way to approach God in prayer. It's through that attitude and mindset that we seek for him to respond to us, and not through the words that we can string together in any specific way. We see this even in Jesus, right? Turn over to Mark 12. The night before his crucifixion, as Jesus prays, and he prays, knowing what is about to come. Said Mark 12, I think I mean Mark 14. Mark 14 in verse 32. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, that the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. So even in Jesus' own life, this humility and submission to the Father was the foundation of the attitude that he brought. Even though he was God incarnate on earth, right? He still humbled himself before the Father and before his will and brought this attitude. And it wasn't wrong for him to ask for God to change his will, right? That's not in any way a fault that Jesus had in this. It was an okay thing for him to do, but it still had to be done with a humility and a commitment to God and his will and his purposes, whatever that may mean for him. And so as we think about what we say in prayer, it's not that it's irrelevant, but remember that we are warned not to make a display of our words. We are warned not to try and appeal to God on the basis of our words. And we're even told that our Father knows what we need even before we ask. And so what we do in our appeal to God is bring an attitude of humility and commitment to his will. And when we put that in our foundation with a desire for an intimate relationship with him, it builds the foundation upon which both the rest of our prayer and the rest of our relationship with God is built. On a personal level, this was a challenge for me, quite frankly. I've realized for quite a while that probably this is my biggest weakness as a Christian. Prayer in general, yes, but especially this aspect of prayer and really having it in my own life. I may devote myself to spiritual things and meditations, but those things don't eliminate the need for this kind of commitment and this kind of time and this kind of exercise on my part in my relationship with my Father. I won't make you go through all the analysis of that for me personally, but I recognize that as a younger Christian, I didn't develop this, and I didn't commit myself to this. And that's kind of worked against me, right? Because now that I've grown, right, it's easy to say, well, I haven't had this. I've gotten by. I've done okay without this, right? And not that I maybe even consciously say those things, but just that's in my attitude. That's in my mindset, if I'm being completely honest. And when I've tried to improve on this, I get too caught up in the words and too focused on the different things that I'm told that I'm supposed to say or following some kind of formula. And quite frankly, at times it's almost felt awkward then to try and give myself to this. And I know that I'm probably not alone in this either, right? That others struggle in the same way. There's lots of things that can impact us. Even our relationships with our earthly fathers, I think, can have an impact sometimes on our mindset and our commitment to do this. But thankfully, we can recognize that we have a patient Father, that this type of practice in our lives isn't something that just pops up overnight, right? That we just come out of the water of baptism and all of a sudden it's there. It's a dependency that takes time to develop. It sometimes may require us to start with a commitment to do this despite the awkwardness that it feels and despite the challenge that it gives for us. But hopefully over time, that forcing almost that we have to make ourselves do this turns into a desire for it and a dependency on it. And as we start to grow, as we make this commitment, we realize that this not just is something that's optional to our relationship, but that we'll never have the relationship with God that he desires for us and that we ultimately should desire without these things in our life. And so each day we try to make this commitment, knowing that, again, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that we go out and just start to put into place tomorrow, but we work towards each day developing this kind of dependency, developing this kind of intimacy that comes with the Father. Again, I don't want to ignore the other roles that prayer has in our time collectively or in our day-to-day in the midst of those moments, right? But sometimes I think it's easier for us to do that than it is to really have this intimate time with the Father. And so that's our challenge this morning. It's the thought that I want to leave us with as we think about Jesus and his example, is to give space, to give time for that, to figure out what it takes, maybe logistical things that we have to figure out, but whatever it may be, to commit ourselves again to this type of space, this type of time, this type of relationship with our Father in prayer. If you need help with this morning and want to seek the help of others, or if you want to seek help in any other way as you seek to walk with God, let us know and come forward as we stand and sing.